Welcome to Sharp Knife Shop. My name is Gage, and today I'd like to show you how to sharpen your knife. So the first thing we need to do when sharpening our knives is prep our whetstones. We're going to soak them in room temperature water for about 10 or 15 minutes, or until the bubbling subsides and water pools on top. You'll notice when you put your stones into the water that they start bubbling up at you. This is totally normal. This is just the stone soaking up all the water necessary to stay hydrated during the sharpening process. Again, once that bubbling subsides and water pools on top rather than soaking right into your stone, you know your stones are prepped and ready for sharpening. We're going to move through a progression of 3 whetstones today, starting off with a coarse grit 320 stone, moving on to a medium grit 1000 grit stone, and finishing off with our 5000 grit or finishing fine stone. Our coarse grit stone is going to quickly and efficiently remove material from our knife and help us create a new edge on our knife. The edge that we achieve off of this coarse grit stone is going to be kind of scratchy and rough and not super desirable for our cutting feel. So we're going to move on to our medium grit stone, which is going to sort of bridge the gap between our coarse grit and fine grit stone. The medium grit stone, again, is going to start refining the edge of our knife and get it ready for our fine grit stone. Lastly, our fine grit stone is going to further polish and refine the edge of our knife and help us get that really silky smooth cutting feel that we're all after. It's important to note here that if your knife is in relatively good shape, you may not have to go all the way down to a 320 or other coarse grit stone. It's important to remove as little material as possible when we're sharpening, so going down to these low grit stones unnecessarily is not a good idea. Next thing we need to do is find the grip that feels comfortable for us. This is going to be different for everyone, so don't get too hung up on what your grip is. Find something that feels comfortable for you and allows you to move the knife easily across the stone. Me personally, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to grab my knife with my right hand. I'm going to put my index finger onto the spine of the knife, and I'm going to place my thumb onto the heel of the knife. It's important to note that no hand pressure should come from our right hand. Our right hand is staying locked in place, our wrist is staying locked in place, and it's simply maintaining the angle that we choose and moving the knife forward and backward across the stone. All the hand pressure is going to come from our left hand, and more specifically from our index and middle fingers. We're going to want to try to keep our fingers as close to the edge of the knife as possible, but it's important to make sure that you're not running your finger across the whetstone. You may not notice at first, but the stone will slowly wear skin away on your finger. You'll end up with a big hole in your finger and you'll start bleeding all over the place, which obviously is not what we're after. Once you've found a comfortable grip, it's now time to find an appropriate angle to sharpen our knife at. This is again going to differ from person to person based on what you're using your knife for, but a general rule of thumb is that we'll sharpen our stainless steel knives at around 20 to 25 degrees. These are going to be like your run-of-the-mill Henkels or Wusthoffs or other similar European-style stainless steel knives. While our high carbon and high quality Japanese steel knives, we're going to sharpen flatter to the stone at around 10 to 15 degrees. This is because a higher carbon steel is harder and therefore will keep its edge for longer. That's not to say that you couldn't sharpen a Henkel or a Wusthof very flat to the stone, but if you do something like that, chances are you'll get your knife very sharp, but it won't hold this edge for very long. There are many different methods to finding the angle that you want to sharpen at, so whether it's 20 or 10 or 15. Those include like using the penny method where you stack up 3 pennies next to your knife and lay your knife down to find your angle. Some people use a matchbook. It doesn't really matter. What I find most effective when teaching my in-store classes here at Sharp is to arrange our knife at a 90-degree angle on our stone. We can therefore cut that in half to 45, cut that in half again to 22 and a half. This, again, roughly speaking, is where we're going to sharpen our standard stainless steel knives. If we know where 22 and a half is, we can angle down slightly, and this is the angle that we will sharpen our higher quality Japanese steels at. Again, depending on your style of cutting or the style of food that you're preparing, you may want to experiment with different angles. General rule of thumb though is that the flatter to the stone you're sharpening the knife, the better the cutting feel will be, but the more delicate your edge is. This means that it is more prone to chipping and will likely lose its edge a little bit quicker than if you were to sharpen your knife at around 20 or 25 degrees. A 20 or 25 degree angle might not have the same cutting feel as a 10 or 15 degree angle, but it will be less delicate and it will likely hold its edge for longer. So now that all the boring talking is over, we're going to start putting some strokes in on our knife. We know the angle that we're going to use. We found a comfortable grip, and we're going to start closest to us on the stone, applying pressure as we push the knife away from ourselves. We're going to remove the knife from the stone, coming all the way back to our starting position, and continue doing that as we work all the way from the heel to the tip and back from the tip all the way down to the heel. What we're trying to achieve here is called a burr. A burr is sort of like a little scratchy lip of steel that forms on the back side of the knife. So if I'm sharpening this side of the knife, I'll feel the burr on the opposite side. The burr is the, in my opinion, single most important part of sharpening. If the burr is not formed properly all the way from tip to heel consistently, you're not going to end up with good results. As we are removing material from our knife, the steel is going to start to fold over the other side of the knife. This is what helps us understand that we've achieved the edge geometry that we need to create a new edge on our knife. Make sure that you are feeling that burr nice and consistently all the way from the heel up to the tip. It should feel the same all the way from tip to heel. And we want to make sure that we're not flipping from one side of the knife to the other before that burr is formed properly on the first side of the knife that we're sharpening. Once that burr is formed, we can flip over and do the other side of the knife. Our grip is going to change slightly when we move from what I would refer to as the dominant side of our knife to the other side. So our thumb on our right hand is now going to move to the spine, our index finger of our right hand to the heel of the knife. With our left hand, our thumb is on the spine and the rest of our fingers are wrapped over, again applying pressure as close to the edge of the knife as possible without running your fingers along the edge. When we're sharpening the back side of the knife, nothing changes. Our angle should be the same, our hand pressure should be the same, and we're trying to form that burr just like we did on the first side of the knife. Again, it's very important to ensure that you're not flipping from side to side at this point. You want to get that burr formed properly all the way from tip to heel. We want to make sure also that we are starting furthest away from us on the stone rather than closest to us like we did on the other side. And we're applying pressure as we pull the knife towards us. This is to ensure that we don't apply pressure with the edge of the knife angled into the stone, which can cause our knife to dig into the stone, ruining all that hard work that we've done. Once we form the burr on side A, flipped over and form the burr on side B, it's now time to remove that burr in a process called deburring. Deburring requires us to put in long strokes, starting at the tip of the knife, moving all the way to the heel, and then flipping over and performing the same stroke on the back side of the knife. Only at this point should you be flipping from side to side every time you put in a stroke. And as you're doing the deburring process, your hand pressure should lighten up to the point where the final few strokes you put in are just enough to keep the knife and stone in contact with one another. So the burr can be a bit of a difficult thing to comprehend over video as it's quite tactile. It's really only easy to explain when you can feel a knife with a burr on it. I wish I could tell you exactly how many strokes you need to put in on your knife to achieve that burr, but it's going to depend on the condition of your knife. If your knife is brand new, it should be very quick and easy to form a burr. If your knife is quite old, it could take anywhere from 5 or 10 minutes or even longer in some cases to get that burr formed. With all of that said, if you are sharpening on a low grit stone like a 320 or lower, the burr should be quite apparent. It should be very obvious that one side of the knife has a quite pronounced scratchy lip on it, while the other side should not feel scratchy or feel like it has any lip on it whatsoever. To understand if you've removed the burr properly, run your fingers along both sides of the knife. You should feel no scratchy lip on either side of the blade. And when you run your fingers down the length of the knife, you should feel the edge sort of cutting into your fingers. Of course, be very careful when you're doing this, but in my experience, this is the only real way to tell if the burr is gone or not. If you're finding that there are little spots on your knife where the burr is remaining, just put in a few more nice long consistent strokes, again switching sides of the knife every time until that burr is gone. So now that we've performed all three of those steps, forming the burr on side A, forming the burr on side B, and deburring our knife on our coarse grit stone, we're going to move on to our medium grit stone and complete all of those same processes all over again. So while you're sharpening, it's important to take a break frequently to flatten out your stone. It's important to flatten your stone so that you can maintain a consistent angle. If your stone becomes dished out or gets a rut in the middle, it will be impossible for you to maintain that consistent angle and your sharpening results will suffer. It's also important to round off the edges of your stone, as while you're flattening your stone, these edges will become very sharp and they will either cut you or they will damage the edge of your knife. As your sharpening improves, I would encourage you to leave your knife in contact with the stone, applying pressure only as you push away from yourself and releasing pressure as you guide the knife back to the starting position along the stone. This is going to help your speed and efficiency, but it's important to make sure that we don't apply pressure on the way back to our starting position, or else we run the risk of digging our knife into the stone. Good rule of thumb is that the spine of your knife should always lead the stroke rather than the edge. So again, form the burr on side A, flip over only once you form the burr, and form a burr on side B again, and then deburr your knife. It's important to note that as we move through our progression from coarse to fine grit stones, our hand pressure should also lighten as we go. So that is to say that the hand pressure we are applying with our 320 grit stone is going to be more forceful than the hand pressure we apply on our 1000 grit stone. And then of course on our fine grit stone, we should be applying very, very minimal pressure. Once we've completed all 3 steps on the medium grit stone, again, completing all 3 steps again on the fine grit stone, at which point it's time to check our work. Now, depending on what you plan to use your knife for will determine how high of a grit you need to go to. It's not always important to go up to like 5,000, 8,000. I've seen stones as high as 30,000 grit before. This isn't always super important, especially if you're just chopping like fruits and veggies and stuff like that. The higher grit stones become very useful when you're slicing very delicate raw proteins. So if you're doing any like sashimi or really thin sliced meat that is raw, typically your cutting feel will really benefit from a higher grit polishing. If you're just chopping onions and cucumbers and stuff like that, you can generally stop at around 3,000 to 4,000 grit and you'll have a really serviceable edge on your knife. Cool, so we've moved through all 3 of our stones in our progression, and now it's time to figure out if we've done a good job or not. So some telltale signs of whether or not you've sharpened your knife properly are going to be the consistency and appearance of the edge on your knife. If you notice that the edge that you've created on your knife is inconsistent in terms of its width from tip to heel, or if you're seeing any cloudy spots or scratching up the side of your knife, anything other than like a nice clean hard line where your edge is, you're being a little bit inconsistent with your angle. Scratching or cloudiness up the side of your blade is usually indicative of you being too flat to the stone. If your edge is non-apparent, you can't even see an edge on your knife, chances are you've been sharpening at too aggressive an angle. There are many ways to test the sharpness of your knife, including the paper test, using your thumbnail or any other fingernail, or slicing a tomato, for instance. But I find the most effective way to test the sharpness of your knife is whether or not you can shave your arm hairs with your knife. If you can't shave your arm hairs with your knife, there is room for improvement. If you want to take your sharpening to the next level, consider using a leather strop, or even a really thick layer of newspaper can be effective at honing your blade. Similarly to what barbers used to use back in the day for their straight razors, the leather strop is going to further refine the edge of your knife, get rid of any micro burrs that may be left on your knife, and just get that edge to the next level. Well, thanks so much for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video and hope that it helped you achieve the sharpening results that you're after. If there's anything that we didn't touch on in the video, or maybe you have some insights that you wanted to provide, leave a comment down below and we'll be sure to answer. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like, it really helps us out. Subscribe to our channel for more knife-related content, and until the next video, stay sharp.